Well, good morning, everybody. Seth Nave here, Extension Soybean Agronomist from the University of Minnesota, and I welcome you to the inaugural edition of the Science for Success webcast. This webinar is just part of a project, a larger project that a number of Extension Soybean agronomists from around the country have put together with support from the United Soybean Board. This is really focused around grower education and pulling together resources from across the country to have some common resources for farmers, educational events, and things like this morning's webcast. So I apologize about my informal background here. I was all set to do this from my webcast room in my office. And I left my key card at home. So I'm here in my lab in my basement in crop sciences here at University of Minnesota. So what Science for Success does is it brings agronomists together from around the country to conduct applied research, then get together and put our heads together and develop educational resources for farmers. These materials are going to be housed on the soybean, are housed currently and will be housed on the Soybean Research Information Network. So for those of you that are interested, that's soybeanresearchinfo.com, soybeaninforesearch.com. Maybe Jenny would be able to put that up in the chat for folks. And today I'm sitting in for our fearless leader, Rachel Van. She's at home with her new baby, Caroline, who's born just this past Monday. So she definitely gets a pass for today, but we're gonna hold her to this next month. She's gonna have to hold that baby and show that baby off at our webcast next month at this time. Again, this webcast is scheduled for every Friday, the first Friday of every month, except July will, because the 4th of July will be on the second Friday. So if you've enjoyed it today, or if you prefer a different moderator, be sure to try back next week. So today we've got Emerson Nafziger from University of Illinois, Hans Kandel from North Dakota State University, Jeremy Ross from the University of Arkansas, Mark Licht from Iowa State University, Carrie Knott from University of Kentucky, and I see several other extension agronomists from around the country are on as well. And so I welcome anybody to chime in at any time. This is really intended to be an absolutely very informal webcast. And in fact, the success of this is based entirely on questions from you all out there in the ether as an audience participant. So we really, we can hear each other talk all the time, and we do. We're here to hear from you and understand what's happening out there. So I thought, as a little teaser to get things going this morning, I thought what I would do is give now a week-old crop report for each of these states and let each of the agronomists give us kind of an update what's happened this week and how things are faring in their state coming up. So I'll start alphabetically here. We've got Arkansas. Last week's crop report said Arkansas was 38% planted compared to 29% historical average. So, Jeremy, how are you sitting this over this past week? It sounds like you've had some rain.
Well, first off, I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today. And as Seth said, this is for y'all. So if y'all have questions, by all means, start putting those in the chat. But yeah, we're wet. Actually, was yesterday going home was the first time I saw any equipment in the field this week. We had a pretty good rain event over the weekend and the first of this week, and then sporadic showers throughout the rest of the week. And then they're predicting anywhere from 2 to 3 inches starting Sunday through next Wednesday. So we were actually ahead of the schedule, and I was feeling really confident that we could get a pretty good early crop in. And the southern part of the state's looking pretty good. I've actually talked to one of my growers down there, and he's completely done planting beans. He's got several thousands already planted and starting to come up. But you get to central, northeast Arkansas, and there's some guys that hadn't even put the first bean in the ground. So it seems like it's kind of becoming the norm, having a wet April, May, but I'm hoping we can break out of this pattern and try to get some soybeans planted here in the next couple of weeks.
Good. And over to Becky and Carrie. Not let's how much different is the weather over in your area? It looks like you had a pretty good start this year, 26% last week compared to 10 on average. So how have things fared this last week?
Well, we've got a ton of rain, like Jeremy said. We've probably got every system that Jeremy picked up as well. Tons of rain, tornadoes, and some other problems. But with our soils, we haven't been able to get back in given the amount of rain we've had. And so we probably are holding pretty true to that 25% planted in soybeans this year. Emergence is pretty slow, right? Some people planted in mid-March, myself included, and those beans kind of languished underground for over a month. And now they're kind of struggling to get good stands. And so in our trials, our stands are about 40 to 50,000 plants per acre. And so I'm hoping maybe that's just us and not sort of statewide, but I fear that with some cold temperatures we had and some freeze events after planting in March, that some of our very ultra early plantings are struggling. But other than that, those guys that got planted, in April and some more timely, not ultra earlys, are pretty pleased with their progress. So there will not be any planters rolling this week, maybe not even next week, because like Jeremy, we're supposed to pick up another inch or so of rain, not 2 or 3, I think 1 to 2. And that's going to keep us out with our soil type.
Thank you, Carrie. I think this is going to be a good, I think it's a good topic to come back to. Some of these very, very early planted soybeans, I'm curious to hear, based on locale environments, that we know that there was a lot of very early planted soybeans went into a lot of states. And so I'm kind of curious to hear from others what they're looking like. And so Emerson Knapziger at Illinois, last week's crop, you got a really good early, very, very early start. Got 41% planted by last week. How do things look now after some cold temperatures?
Well, good morning, everybody, and thanks, Seth. It's been one of the odder seasons I've seen in terms of planting. We had below normal rainfall in the most of Illinois in the month of April. We only had about 2 inches here in East Central Illinois, where I'm located. And that meant that, it was soil conditions were, I'll say, okay to plant most of the month of April in much of the state, but our warmest time of the month was in the first week of April, and then it was pretty cool. We had some 0 growing degree day accumulations, meaning the high temperature was less than 50, several days in the middle part of the month, and it warmed up a little bit. We don't mind if it rains this time of year, but the big problem is that when it's the high temperature in the day is 55 or 60, it doesn't dry up. And that's really where we're at right now. There are fields that were planted this week here. We didn't get much rain. We've dodged most of the rain here in this end of the state. And so we'll advance past 50% this week, which is, Seth, as you said, stays above head of normal for us. And but some of those that were planted very early were coming up just at the wrong time. It got down to about 28 to 30 degrees around the 20th of April. And we had some thousands of acres that were killed by frost. It takes a lot to kill soybeans by frost, but if they're coming up, just have that hook above the soil. That's the most vulnerable stage right there. And it just, those radiate to the sky and freeze, and that's the end for that plant. So we know there's going to be some replanting. The super early start to planting is, and some of those that are going to be replanted were planted in March. We had a fairly good ability to plant in the last week of March. A lot of people held off just because the temperatures were so unfavorable, but a lot of people went ahead. They've been hearing this drumbeat that March is a better month to plant than April. I really don't know exactly where that all came from, but certainly last year in Northern Illinois and this year, more in west central Illinois, I think there are some people that are seeing what the downside of that is. That's going to be a long, slow process, but it's sort of a simple fact, but if the month of April is cool and March is cool, and then early planting doesn't do you as much good as if these are warmer months. And our best setup for crop was still remains 2018, when we didn't get planting particularly early, but May was the average high temperature in May 2018 was 80 degrees. And that warm start is something that I've come to think is one of the most important things to set up the crop for really doing well. We'll come out with stands. I've heard that some of the stands are pretty marginal that are coming up now. Certainly those that were planted into tilled corn stalks, which would have been most of them, those were not ideal conditions. Soybean stubble was where corn got planted is in good condition. And so the corn, I would say, went into better soil conditions than the soybeans did. If it had warmed up like it was supposed to, and we had gotten some rainfall, we'd have good stands. I'm suspicious that there are some pretty marginal soybean stands out there. Not quite as bad as you mentioned for Kentucky, Carrie, but certainly people that are going to be deciding whether, I suspect, whether 80 or 90,000 plants is going to do the job for them. And the only good part of that is that our temperatures have accumulated so slowly that a planting, before it starts to warm up is going to be not very much different than planting 3 weeks ago, just in terms of getting the crop up and getting it developing.
Thank you very much, Emerson. I think those are really excellent points. And I think, I think one of the questions we run into in the upper Midwest is around working days and concern that we're not going to get another chance. And so those are risk management decisions that all these farmers have to make. Certainly March planting is much different than, when we're looking at a late April, May planting window. But I think those are really good points. We're going to go over to Iowa with a really similar situation in terms of planted acreage. So hear from Mark Licht and hear what's happening this past week.
Yeah, so we're planting like crazy. Just like Emerson had mentioned, we had some really early planted soybeans in the end of March, although I think it really started up pretty quickly as we got into the first 10 days of April on soybean planting. A matter of fact, I know several farmers that had already planted 1,000 acres or more of soybeans before the 10th of April. So we did get a really early jump. I know another group of farmers that finished planting soybeans before they even started corn. So we have that going on. This week, we're going to see another big jump in soybean planting acreage in Iowa. Quite honestly, we did have a little bit of rain that went through the west central, the north central part of the state, but they were planting again the next day. So we are in a dry pattern. I see on the drought monitor now we've increased area and intensity of drought. Again, and that's really our concern. The biggest questions we've been getting the last 2 weeks are, how deep do we plant soybeans? What happens if we only get a 1/4 inch of rain on them and they swell, but they don't do much else? So those are the types of questions that we're seeing right now. And then the other question that we're getting is, what do we do with herbicide programs because of lack of rainfall? So that's kind of where we're at and what we're looking at right now.
Thank you very much, Mark. Yeah, cold, I would say from my experience here in 20 some years in Minnesota, I don't remember a cold, dry spring. It's just not a combination we see. But Hans is from North Dakota, and I'm sure in Western North Dakota, for sure, those farmers are familiar with cold and dry. So what should we be doing?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. So Seth did not mention how many acres we have planted, but up to now is about 1%. That was the last crop report on the beginning of the week. And this morning, waking up, it was 32 degrees. And yesterday it was a little frost. There is still a little frost potential for this coming night. So the temperatures are cold, and Emerson is saying 40 degrees is cold. Well, 32 is not very conducive for planting. So I think farmers are kind of on the fence because what Seth is mentioning, in North Dakota, the majority of the state is in the drought conditions, severe drought in the western part. And Mark is already bringing up, what do you do when you don't have moisture? So right now we have the low temperatures and we have very limited moisture. So are you going to wait to put the seed in? Are you going to put the seed in when there is still some moisture and just let it sit there for a little bit, and it can absorb that little bit of moisture and then come out of the ground? Very risky either way. So next week the temperatures are going to warm up, and then typically we have a pretty rapid warming up of the climate here. So I think that by the middle of next week, we'll see everybody going in very rapidly. And then typically for us, the 15th of May is when half of the acres have been planted in the past. I don't think that is going to happen this year. So we are late with starting. We are very cool and we are very dry, which gives a lot of challenges with the planting decisions.
Yeah, Hans, you're in an interesting situation here in North Dakota where, a lot of other states, we've really increased our planting rate because farmers are using much, much, much larger equipment. But, in North Dakota, you're already running such huge equipment already. I don't know how much larger and faster you all can put your crop in. So, I don't want to disregard the South, but I think this question about planting depth and temperature is a good one. I don't remember a year, we're going to come back to the South, but I don't remember a year where we've had farmers that have really wanted to drill soybeans down below 2 inches. So I'd like to hear from some of you all that have had some experience with deep planting in soybeans and how you fared, and especially relative to residue levels and things like that. And then I sure want to hear some questions from the audience. So be sure to hit us up in the chat with some questions if you've got them.
We do have a question in the chat. Are there any physiological processes that happen in the seed and seedling before emergence when it takes 30 days to emergence that may produce a yield advantage?
Well, I'd say that the chances of producing a yield disadvantage might be just as great as an advantage. When the seed is surrounded by soil that's at 40 degrees, I can't think that there's very much positive happening. The germination process will get underway, but I've seen people make sort of wild claims about how the root system is growing down even if the plant isn't growing. Well, if you're a root system, do you grow down into soil that's 40 degrees? The answer is not very quickly. And if there are some of those, Mike, I don't know what these physiological processes would be. I wrote in one of my articles, we've all wondered about, okay, the seed can sit there for 30 days before it comes up, or 28, 21 days or whatever, but is it doing anything that's helpful? And when it's too cold to come up, my suspicion is the answer is no. I think that we're lucky if when it does come up, it hasn't been damaged in some way that will affect its long-term prospects. I've had a hypothesis for a long time that cold temperatures after emergence might damage yield potential. I work with corn and soybeans, and I've seen it more directly with corn. But we do know that soybeans, when it stays cold for quite a while after they emerge, they can end up affected. Stems can be shortened. And that kind of makes sense just from a developmental standpoint. And although people claim that the yields are just as good, if not better. You know, it just seems like shortening a stem, and, you know, that may help in terms of the plant shape a little bit, helping get light to the lower leaves. But it's hard to see that it's a positive.
Emerson, you and Mark both have appointments working on, have worked on corn considerably over your careers. So contrast these two crops. Corn looks a little bit different when we talk about that early planting and that some of that early slow development. We see some yield responses that we may not see in soybeans. So what's happening in corn that may give us a little additional advantage with the really early planting and slow development?
I guess I wouldn't say that there's very much advantage. Our planting date studies have been pretty clear. You know, we don't see with either corn or soybeans very much response planting from early April to late April most of the time. If we had an unusually warm condition, and our late planting penalty, for example, in 2018 was really severe, it was linear. So I look at planting date, you know, as I think the effects of planting date are pretty much dependent on how fast temperatures accumulate after planting. And another question is, are soybeans planted 10 days apart emerge on a similar date? Is there an advantage to the earlier planting date? Most of the time, I think the answer to that is no. You know, there can be some subtle things possibly, but if those two emergences, and we have planting date studies and can look at this, but you know, if it's cold enough to keep the first ones from doing much until the second ones are planted, I don't see any well, I shouldn't say I don't see a possibility, but I don't know what would happen in those seeds to give those plants an advantage.
We have another question from the chat. Will any of the growth regulators, microbials, amino acids, or other products applied to the seed help with these long cold temperatures?
So the long pauses, I think that very few of us have done any substantial work to be able to address that. That's probably, I see Carrie nodding her head. So thank you for confirming that, Carrie. Yeah, so I just don't think we know enough on some of those applied in furrow or as a seed coating or anything.
You know, they're all well, most of these are biological materials, and they probably respond in cold temperatures about like seed does. Hard to see that they would help a great deal. The disease organisms might be more active at low temperatures. Some of them are.
Yeah, I was going to chime in on that one, that, you know, we really haven't looked at a lot of these, you know, growth regulators and biostimulants, but we have done quite a bit of work on insecticide, fungicide, seed treatments here in the Mid-South, and we do see an advantage or better stands in situations where, you know, the seed stay in the ground for an extended period of time. So, you know, we do recommend, you know, especially early in the season where you could have some really cool wet conditions, you know, looking at those insecticide, fungicide, seed treatments, and we've actually seen some positive returns on those.
And I just want to come back to the question about, you know, the planting soybeans 10 days apart, and if they emerge at the same time, you know, if there's any advantage. You know, in Kentucky and maybe some other places, the advantage is just logistics, right? Typically, we've been getting a lot of rains in the spring that keep us out of the field, and if the soybeans are there, and even if they emerge at the same time, you know, they're at least planted, right? And so for us, we've struggled the last couple of years with really wet seasons, and either you're going to plant early and then the middle part of what we would typically say is a good planting range, you know, into late April and early May, we've been so wet we can't get planted. And so that's why I think a lot of our producers are hedging a little earlier, just so their beans are in, right? And then we're not past that sort of critical, mid to late May, where we would expect yield disadvantages for those planting timings.
So maybe I might chime in from a northern perspective. So we are not talking about planting in April, but we're talking about May and then a day later in May. And if you look at our growing season is actually very short, and the first frost is already in the third week of September. So any day that you can plant earlier gives you one more day. So the one day in our northern climates makes a difference, about a third of a bushel probably. And then Kara was talking about the challenges of also getting the crop in. If the soil is ready now, I would be tempted to go and plant, because next week will be good. And if you wait a few days, that means your last planted acre will also be delayed a few days. So you have to look at the whole farm as well, that if the conditions are right, you're not always sure you can get in when the rain comes again. So for northern climates, planting as the conditions are ready is very important, given that we have a very short season here. So don't plant when it is very cold, but now in May, I'm thinking, well, it is about time.
Back to that question.
So let me
planning-
layer.
Oh.
Sorry, go ahead, Emerson, go
Back to
ahead.
the question of planting date, there was a comment in the chat about some varieties have had more struggles planted 2 inches deep than others. And, I think 2 inches should definitely be a limit. Remember that soybeans have to pull the cotyledons out of the soil. And it's always easier to pull them out, leave the seed coat an inch deep than it is to leave it 2 inches deep. I think it's kind of a guessing game, but there are not going to be very many conditions where a 2-inch planting depth ends up being much better than an 1.5 inches or 1.25 inches to 1.5 inches. Moving the soil around the seed and getting good seed soil contact is important, and leaving it, to emerge without mechanical interference is important. And I think we need to do what we need to do to get that to happen. If the soil is dry at 1.5 inches deep, it's probably dry at 2 inches deep. This is a tricky thing. We've almost never, in my experience, waited to plant, at least not in the last 20 years, because it was too dry. Some people waited to plant this year in the middle of April, which I've never seen before, just because it was too cool. But, we're in the eastern part of the Corn Belt, and having it stay dry, well, it did in 2012, but having it stay dry for an extended period such that soybean or corn seed just sat there and didn't do anything is a very rare event.
There's
So
another.
I'd like to come back to I'll come back to that question regarding planting depth. I think as long as we're on that, there was a question about hypocotyl length. And I remember 10 years ago, there was a big push from the industry to rate varieties by hypocotyl length. I personally kind of chalk this up to all the other things, is that the companies wanted another column to put in their data sheet or their cell sheets. But what do you all think about hypocotyl length? Is it really important? Is it important, especially in high residue situations, if we're going to especially if we're going to plant deep and have a lot of corn residue there? Is hypocotyl length important, and are there differences? Are there real differences between varieties?
Are they ever tested at lower soil temperatures, like 40 or 45 degrees? My guess is not. And if that's the case, then, are we really looking at useful information there? I guess I've never seen a whole field, that everything got just before it cracked the soil surface and then stopped because it didn't have a long enough hypocotyl.
Well, I think environment plays into what that hypocotyl length is to some degree, right? So you can get faster growth or slower growth, and your soil moisture at the time of germination emergence is going to affect that. So while there may be some small differences, I don't think in a field setting, I don't think we're going to be able to pick up on those differences.
The direct
As
message.
long as
in-
we're talking on these academic, yeah, let me run one more by these. So sorry, Jenny. As long as we're on this talk or this point about this academic point about hypocotyl length, what about seed size? Larger seed has a larger energy reserve for emergence, but also gives you a lot of larger area, larger mass to push up through that soil. So what do you all think about this somewhat controversial topic in soybean related to seed size and emergence?
Well, I think cold score is probably way more important than the size of the seed. And, you know, the seed coat integrity is involved in that. And larger seed would tend to be a little bit less in that regard. But you know, if we're looking at the difference between 2,800 and 2,900, I don't think it makes a whole lot of difference. Especially
Okay,
if
Jenny, you can ask your
temperature's
question now.
45 degrees.
Okay, this is a direct message in the chat. If these soybeans emerge are basically standing still with cold temperatures, does that favor insect or slug activity? Should I spray a foliar insecticide?
In Kentucky, it would favor some bean leaf beetle damage, I think, is what we've seen in the past. And so depending on, you know, with our ultra early and even some of our early planting dates, we emphasize that they need to scout and scout again, because the bean leaf beetle can really diminish stands pretty quickly if it's a pretty bad infestation. And so at that point, we do have thresholds on insecticide sprays. Blanket applications, just because you planted early, are not a great idea for us. Slugs, I don't know if anybody has found the secret, but in Kentucky, we cannot control them with any sort of economical pesticide means. And so we just typically pray for sunny weather and warm temperatures so the slugs go away. And that happens some years and some years it doesn't. And again, in Kentucky, we maybe have worse problem than some other areas because we are no-till, right? And so we're no-tilling into corn stubble, and the slugs have all kinds of places to hide. So there's just not an effective pesticide means for slugs other than warm, sunny days.
Yeah, I'll chime in a little bit on that because we've been dealing with slugs, you know, for the last several years. And especially in our cover crop areas, you know, we've got, you know, I guess 2 different camps of cover crop, you know, that people that utilize cover crops. Ones that want to burn it down, you know, 2 weeks prior to planting. We typically don't see the slug problems, but we also have a group of producers that like to plant into, you know, standing green cover crops, and that tends to be a little bit more problematic on the slugs. But just like Carrie said, I mean, there's really not an economical treatment for slugs. You know, they've got baits and things like that, but I think they're in the ballpark of $40 to $50 per acre, and you know that's just not going to be feasible to do. Others have, you know, said, what about potassium chlorate or, you know, potash or something like that? The problem with that is you've got to get it physically on the slug to really do any good. And so, you know, if the slugs are kind of concentrated around the plants, you know, you're going to miss, you know, 90% of them because you're just not going to be able to get a good coverage. But we've had to deal with slugs. You know, so far, really haven't seen fields that had to be replanted yet. You know, they look pretty ratty, but like Carrie said, we pray for sunny, dry weather to kind of push them on down back into the soil, and hopefully not continue to have these rainy periods where they thrive.
Just a comment on bean leaf beetle. Our entomologists always said that, you know, the only way they can hurt soybeans is if they smother the plants. A lot of people think that there's not a very good threshold for those, and if they're taking out stand, certainly there is, but I've never seen them take stand out. They might eat the cotyledons off or the first leaves, but those plants usually will come back. When a lot of fields are coming up sort of at the same time, and I think that's what we're seeing this year. Bean leaf beetle issue goes way down or goes away because there just are too many plants for the beetles. And if there's only a 1 or 2 per plant, they're not a big thing. These aren't the kind of weather conditions that really make insects blow up very fast either. So I think the timing is going to be in favor of the crop a little bit this year.
Yeah, Emerson repeats a really important point, is that biologically, a lot of these, we're talking about a relatively narrow range where all these different species and groups of animals and plants and fungi, bacteria, all function mostly within a fairly narrow temperature range. I mean, some favor a little bit warmer and some favor a little bit cooler. But basically, the warmer things get, everything gets sped up, and the cooler things get, everything slows down. And so it's just a little bit of a question about that relative shift, and is one thing favoring another. And so we had a question on slugs, and I don't know much about slugs here in Minnesota, so I'm asking the question is what is that temperature range for slugs, and can the soybeans outgrow them if you plant early or late? What's the best condition besides just having that sunny weather?
They will eat off the plant altogether, I assume, right? And
They can. I've seen them, but not enough to, they'll tend to stand a little bit, but not enough for a replant usually.
The last couple of years, we have had some isolated fields. I'm not going to say it's widespread in Kentucky, but there have been a few farmers that have had to replant due to slug damage. And it was typically on these earlier planted soybeans that then had cool season. And so the plant wasn't growing very rapidly. The slugs were out and feeding. And, the problem with slugs is it just nips it off. It's just gone. And you really have no idea, when you're trying to do a postmortem, what's happened very easily. And so I would say early plantings, at least in Kentucky, are more susceptible to slug damage just because of our weather patterns and temperatures and stuff.
I see a question on seed corn maggot on soybean. Oh, so go ahead, Mark. Sorry.
No, I was just going to throw a bone out there in the sense that at least in Iowa, where we see slugs, it's typically associated with cover crops and planting soybeans green into them. A little bit different environment, and I know at least in Iowa, the cover crop acres are roughly 5% of our total row crop, so it's not a huge percentage there, but that's where we would see them. And again, just to echo what others have said, controlling them has tended to be more of an issue, but we also are not seeing anything that would get us to the level that we would need to be considering replanting, though.
I have not heard anything about seed corn maggot. I would guess that the insecticide that's on most soybean seed is probably diminishing that, but I don't know that for a fact. There was
and I think that's really I think that's part of this question. And I think certainly there's always this push for more seed treatment on soybean, and there's a constant search for problems that we could fix with some of these things. Sometimes it's real and sometimes it's not. And so I think to document some of this damage is really important, because these seed treatments are highly effective against these soil-borne insects. But just putting these things down, if we've never known we had a problem or don't expect to have a problem, doesn't seem like a good management to me. So any other thoughts on insect damage?
Seth, this is Mike Staten from Michigan. Can I chime in on the seed corn maggot question?
You may.
I really appreciate it. I have seen seed corn maggot injury in soybeans in several fields, and typically it is heavy manure applications, dairy farms, things like that will attract the flies. It's basically decaying material, that organic material that attracts the adult flies. So if you've got a scenario where you've got a cover crop or a weedy field where there's a lot of green material that has been incorporated and is decaying, that will attract the adult maggot flies. So I have seen it, and I have seen it seen the seed treatments fail. And the one that failed for me was Gaucho, and it was after a manured field. I checked with Ohio State. Laura, I think you had an entomologist there, Mike somebody, that had done some work, or Michaels had done some work on it and showed that Gaucho was not as effective or not perfect on seed corn maggot. So I think the insecticides do vary, but it can be a problem in soybeans in certain scenarios. So what Chris DeFonso recommends here in Michigan is waiting at least 2 weeks after you've incorporated any kind of green manure crop or any manure before you plant soybeans. Allow 2 weeks for that material to decay before you plant.
Thank you, Mike. I think those are good comments, and I want to really come back to the key nugget within this is that, you know, we're again back to these kind of what some people would call antiquated IPM principles. I mean, he's really talking about managing based on those acres that have a greater risk of having problems. So after manure, heavy green manure, or in some of these cover crops. So we may need to start looking at some of these things after some of these heavy cover crops and looking at a different set of recommendations for some seed treatments. But without those kind of backings. Yep, go ahead, Emerson.
The initial question you added to it, a person that posted it said, I'm seeing seed corn feeding on seed with and without Gaucho, Central Illinois. Is that in a field that has manure or some other source of material that the flies would be attracted to? Tillage 2 days before planting. It's not a very common problem, but I'm certainly a lot of problems aren't very common, but they're still serious.
I just wanted to touch on, I wanted to, touch on one comment or one question here, and we might want to wrap up in a little bit if we don't see more questions, but back to this working days question, and with the evolution of how we're managing soybeans with herbicides and really a lot of emphasis on this pre-emergence herbicides, what are you seeing or what are you folks hearing from farmers in terms of planning for planting around that early spray? Is that part of their logistics as they're looking forward at the weather? Are they building this into their plan? Or are we just getting soybeans planted as ASAP and then worry about getting those pre's down?
I can talk from the southern perspective. So I think every farmer goes into the season with the plan of, you know, planting and having the spray rig right behind the planter, putting out their pre-emerge applications. But, you know, it seems like the last few years, that's pretty much just gone out the window. And when they get a window to plant, they're planting as fast as they can. And in some situations, you know, they may get caught by rain and not able to get in there, you know, right behind the planter to put out their pre-emergence. So there have been some situations where guys have, you know, been delayed getting on those pre-emergence. And in certain parts of Arkansas, you know, we have resistant Palmer amaranth right now 6 different modes of action. So if you start getting Palmer amaranth up prior to a pre-emerge, you're really limited. And especially some of these, you know, with the dicamba and the glufosinate tolerant varieties, you know, really to control those, you're having to put out one of your shots, you know, too early to really control those, you know, problematic weeds. And so, you know, I tell guys, you know, we need to have, you know, start clean and then with a good, you know, burn down operation, and then make sure you're following up the planter with that pre-emerge application just to prevent some of these problems. But I've already had a couple of, you know, farmers call me, really didn't get a good burn down, and so they've got some mare's tail and some other things that are coming up. And the technology that they have in the soybeans, there's really no good option, you know, for controlling those weeds once they're up and growing. And so, you know, we still emphasize we need to really get those good pre-emergence with multiple modes of action down right behind the planter. But, you know, in the ideal world, that would be great, but you know, we don't live in the ideal world, and so we just have to live with that. But we do, you know, here in the Mid-South, we can go from too much soil moisture to a drought in a matter of about 10 days. And so we either fight, you know, too wet conditions trying to get stuff out, or, you know, we lose our soil moisture and have no moisture for activation. And so we kind of live on that fine line every year. But, you know, our recommendations, again, is just try to, you know, follow up the planter with those pre-emerge applications.
I did receive another direct message in the chat box. Is seed vigor important to early planted beans? And how do I find out what seed vigor is on my seed?
It's essential. So if you're going to do ultra early or early plantings, you have to know your seed vigor. And if you don't know it, don't plant it. So I think most of the states have state seed testing laboratories that can give you this information. At Kentucky, we have ours under UK Regulatory Services, and each farmer is entitled to one free test per year. It's not going to be on the seed tag, and germination is not equivalent to vigor. So germination is, can y'all tell I've had this talk a lot in the last 3 years. Germination is the percentage of seedlings that can emerge in perfect conditions. And I don't know a single field anywhere in the world that's going to have perfect conditions, right? And so if you're going into stressful conditions, especially these ultra earlies for us, these March plantings, some people are pushing February here, which is incredible. You have to know that vigor. And for us in Kentucky, I think it's the accelerated aging, a cold test, you know, it goes under a variety of names, but basically you want to know how much percentage is going to emerge in stressful conditions.
Carrie, I would echo that. Very, very good statement. I've been involved in a couple farmer trials where they've done ultra early versus normal planting dates. And one of the big things that you notice very quickly is the drop in emergence rate. I cannot stress that enough. And I think it comes back to this seedling vigor and germination in colder environments, essentially. So if you want to plant early, I would recommend at very least planting 20% higher seeding rates, because at least in our typically cold and wet Iowa soils, you're going to see a pretty big drop there.
Yeah,
I should mention that seed's not free, right? So you increase your seeding rate by 20%. Some of you that are better economists than me can figure out that you need to have a nice increase in yield to be able to offset that.
yeah. So we've been dealing with seed quality, you know, for the last several years, and actually had a 3-year project funded by our promotion board looking at this. And so we typically don't worry about early season, you know, vigor. Late season vigor is where we really have issues, and that's where your accelerated aging comes into play. It's a warm test, I guess, for lack of better words. And so just make sure, you know, if you are looking at some of these vigor tests, you know, are you looking at a cold test? Are you looking at a warm test? That'll depend on, you know, kind of what part of the growing season you're looking at. But by all means, you know, every winter meeting I talk about germ and accelerated aging, like Carrie was talking about. But, you know, germ is stated on the bag, you know, it's the one that's regulated, but a lot of the companies, they may test for vigor, but, you know, they may test it in, you know, November, December, January, but that number can change. Typically in our research, the germ typically doesn't change as long as you store that seed and, you know, properly, but the vigor is kind of changing every day. And so even if you test it, you know, January, February, you may want to test it closer to planting just to kind of give you an idea of when do you kind of need to place that seed. Typically we want our less vigorous seed planted, you know, during the prime time, you know, starting, you know, 1st of May, you know, through the end of May. Once we get to the 1st of June, where we typically have about 25% of our crop planted, that's really where that accelerated aging number comes into play. And so you really want to have really good germ and accelerated aging scores on that seed that you plant later in the season.
So one of the things that Mark was talking about, increasing seeding rate when it is early planted. But we do have to realize that regardless if you plant in an optimum time, you typically still get 10% of the seeds that are viable. So you've already compensated for germination, still will not make it due to various reasons like insects, seeds too closed under a rock, or can't emerge. So we have to realize that, you know, in the normal conditions, you have a difference between the number of seeds you plant, the viable seeds, and the plants that you actually get.
I wanted to make one comment. There was a comment or a question a while ago about the penalty for planting delays right now, and asking about a 3rd to a 5th bushel. It's transitioning. I think now our data would show that from the 10th to the 20th of May, we lose about 3%. If you want to put it on a percentage basis, and that would be, you know, about 0.4 to 0.5 per day, but pretty variable. And when it's cool like this, I would think that the delay, the penalty may be a little bit on the lower side, just because getting it planted right now isn't going to bring it up very fast. So we can never be exact about these things, but we're certainly entering the time period when each day of delay is going to cost some in yield. Our hope is that, you know, it's not going to be a lot, and it never drops off a cliff. You know, we had good yields in 2019 planting in the 1st and 2nd weeks of June. So it's there's always hope, I guess.
Yeah, our planning date, you know, from an, you know, again, an academic standpoint, when we look at our planning date data, the curves show exactly what farmers see as we can achieve maximum yields in any year from planting very, very early to quite late. The issue is that the variance around that is much smaller in this, you know, late April, early May window. And so the yields attained are all near 100% in that window, whereas very early and very late we can have environmental conditions that drive yields way down. So we're basically talking about risk of low yields with very early planting and risk of low yields with very late planting, but it's always possible to get good yields. So I'd like to wrap things up. I would like to ask each of you if you have any closing comments. Is there anything that we weren't able to address that was on your list that you'd like to touch base and make sure to get out word to farmers before we close today?
I have one question.
Okay, with that, I don't. Oh,
Let me
go ahead, Emerson.
I had a question this last week. They said a farmer by mistake in planting with a drill he wasn't familiar with planted 370,000 seeds per acre in 14-inch rows, and wondered what you would do about that.
If it was here in the Mid-South, I'd say get the rotary hoe out and go at an angle and try to eliminate about 1/3 of that population.
Well, that sounds like surgical precision on that operation. I told him if they come up really uniformly and there really are that many plants, he might consider cultivating out or spraying out every other row. But, you know, I suspect that might be actually too high and you could actually lose yield. But they're going to do a lot of self-thinning at that kind of population.
Yeah, soybeans are very good at self-thinning. So there's going to be a lot of those will be lost very early. So even without a rotary hoe, we're going to thin those out a lot. But you're definitely going to be at more of a risk of in areas with white mold and things like that, where you have some foliar diseases, you could be at an increased risk for sure. Any other comments from folks? With that, I really thank all of the attendees today. I really appreciate you coming on Friday morning. And I know there's a lot of farmers that are pushing in the field. We've had pretty good window in a lot of states and want to wrap things up. And so I'm sure it limited our audience. But this is our initial run at this. And so we're going to improve every month. We're going to be back in the month of June. And again, this is Science for Success. It's a group of soybean agronomists from around the country. It's a project supported by the United Soybean Board. So I'm going to close up, and as I mentioned in the chat, please pass any unanswered questions back to Rachel. When between diaper changes, she's going to help answer questions for everybody. So again, really appreciate it. Thank you for your time, and a big round of applause for our panelists this week. Good job, folks.
Thanks, Sal.